Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got in my sights are the two bins that are dead ahead. It's a pair of European nightcrawler worm bins that are definitely among my oldest systems. They're now 264 days of age. A couple weeks have passed now since we last checked in on these guys, and they were fed cantaloupe melon and coffee and worm chow. Stuff that I assume that after 14 days has most likely been eaten already. So I'm going to get these systems up on the bench and we're going to take care of getting them fed. So let's get to work. So as I tend to do with my systems that are getting up there in age is I kind of tailor their feedings to consist of either materials that I know are going to break down quickly or materials that I know are small particle size and have very little likelihood of leaving leftovers in the bins. So that's the reason today's feeding is going to consist of coffee and my worm chow. The cantaloupe melon that they got last time, 2 weeks ago, even though it's a fairly popular food item in the worm bins, the cantaloupe, I do still expect to see leftovers of the cantaloupe rinds, because the rinds are a little bit tougher on the cantaloupe melon. So we could potentially still bump into some leftovers of that, or maybe not. It's hard to say. Out here on the surface, you're going to see, might be a little bit difficult to see on the camera, but there's probably no questioning the fact that you do see something out here other than just nice brown castings. All this white stuff that you see are springtails. Why don't we dive down and start looking at what's going on down here in these bins. Poking through the surface more prominently over here, as you can see, is some of the stuff that they were given last time, I assume. So besides the cantaloupe, which we could see some of the leftover of here, this is just that very thin outer skin of the cantaloupe. I could see a lot of potworms. The potworms are these little tiny white worms that usually occupy the worm bins too, and they do tend to show up in great numbers when there's sort of an imbalance. I think when the moisture might be a little bit too high, or maybe when the pH goes in the direction of perhaps a little bit more acidic. I'm not exactly sure, but it does seem to me like even the potworms in here are starting to bloom, if you will. Perhaps even more of them can be seen over here, mixed in with some of this stuff. I was trying to figure out what this stuff was. I was examining it over here too, in the other bin. These might have been those little pastries or little biscuits that I threw in here. I'm fairly certain that those were part of the last feeding too, and the potworms definitely seem to enjoy this stuff. I mean, they're just mounded up on this little piece of cantaloupe rind, like a huge worm ball. Not huge because, I mean, just the scale of what we're looking at here, potworms, they're all pretty puny. But in terms of the pile of them, it's just way more than I'm used to seeing. So why don't we proceed here, digging into the feeding zone to see what we see. As I recall, checking in on these bins was quite fun because the feeding zone did have a tendency to have a nice turnout of many worms. Here we're bumping into one of the ends of the cantaloupe melon, and I can tell just from touching it there's still a good bit of the melon attached to this rind, which actually surprises me a little bit considering the fairly large number of worms occupying these bins. Perhaps that section of cantaloupe rind was just a little bit thicker than most that I feed, and perhaps it's just taken them a little bit longer to work down that fleshy part of the melon. So I was a little bit surprised to see that much leftover melon from last time, 2 weeks ago. Good many worms hanging out down in the feeding zone. I'm not even sure if today's feeding is going to be the type that we normally position in one particular spot, which is in my worm bins typically located down the center of the bin. Sometimes when I feed these small particle size foods like, coffee and worm chow, I'll want to spread the stuff out a little bit more. So I was thinking about possibly arranging this feeding a little bit differently than usual. And that might just really be nothing more than spreading this stuff out a little bit more around the surface or just below the surface, probably covering it up slightly with some of the excavated material that we've pushed off to the sides here. So why don't we proceed down the route of doing it that way. I'll go ahead and excavate a little bit more out of the middle, pushing it over to both sides. I guess along the way I'm checking out some of these leftovers and assembling a little collection of them over here, so that maybe we can include them along with the feeding. These springtails do seem to make their way down into the material, so they're not just strictly a surface dwelling bin critter. They do seem to hang out down within the material along with the worms, helping out with the breakdown of the foods. So that was kind of fun plowing through bin number 1 over here, but I think we're probably set to proceed over to see how things look over in bin number 2. Times like this when I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 little worms on my glove, I almost feel like coming over from one bin to the other, I could possibly be transferring enough worms to turn these two systems into twin bins. I reserve the name twin bin for systems where it's thought that the populations are exactly the same, but for whatever reason we ended up with a averaged calculation of, I don't remember the exact number, but I do remember there was only a difference of 10 worms. So I believe it was thought that perhaps bin number 1, I think, was the one where we estimated the system to have exactly 10 more worms than over here. And I think we're talking about, a number of worms in excess of 1,800. For some reason, 1,870 and 1,880 come to mind now that I'm talking about it. I was actually looking at the tracking spreadsheet where I keep track of these bits and pieces of information. When I was looking at that earlier, I almost wrote down those stats on my little green board to share with you, but I know I've shared it in the past. And for systems that are up there in age like these, it is fair to assume that the worms have been busy mating and reproducing and presumably increasing their numbers, because in a way I would just have to guess that based on what I'm seeing every time I come into these two bins, every time I plow down into the feeding zone, I feel like I'm looking at just so many worms that they just have to be more than those original starting numbers that we came up with, which is great. That's really the whole idea, I suppose. So most recently I've simply been taking two systems, and when they come to an end and I harvest their castings, the occupants of those two systems are transferred into just two new bins to continue as is in their original numbers. With these bins though, just based on the high numbers of worms I'm observing every time we check into feed, I get this feeling like I might want to actually spread these worms out into possibly more than just two new systems when the time comes to transfer them to a new home and harvest their lovely castings. So I've kind of gravitated towards the excavation of a pit down the middle like I normally do. Like I said, I'd really like to sort of spread their feeding out a little bit more. Just trying to think of how to do that. I guess maybe we can just sort of really utilize more of the opening over here than we normally do. I've got, like I saw earlier, I got 2 days worth of coffee here, which includes 2 replacement coffee filters, which means that we could take these old ones that were serving that function of feeding zone indicator and repurpose them as supplemental bedding to go down into the feeding zone. And then we'll just set aside the coffee filters that came along for the ride to be replacement feeding zone indicators. So let's see if we can do what we talked about here, is to kind of spread the material out a little bit more than we normally would. Normally we just drop it in, it kind of lands in the middle, and that's just fine too if we're unsuccessful in spreading it out. But here I feel like I've created a kind of a wider feeding area than normal. And on top of the coffee, we're just going to sprinkle some of my worm chow. And these are the sort of foods that you really would not expect to see many leftovers of. And let's not forget to return some of these yummy bits of leftover food too. Chances are that by the next time we come back in here, which could once again be 2 weeks from now, chances are we're not going to see much, if any, of these little bits of cantaloupe. Over here too, I could see some leftover melons still attached to the rind. There too, this system also received one of these end pieces. But it did somehow appear to me as if the progress of the food was a little bit further along over here in bin number 2. I don't know why, but it did somehow seem to me like they might have done a somewhat better job doing away with the food they got last time. So this is usually where I use the covering up of the feeding zone as an excuse to sort of go a little bit further out into the bin to bring in material to cover up, but at the same time it gives us an opportunity to see how things out there look. Things look pretty good. Here and there I do bump into things that are kind of slow composting, leftover foods from days gone by. This to me feels like a piece of corn cob, and I'm fairly certain I've already encountered a few other pieces that I just didn't point out at the time when I bumped into them. So let's do the same here. Kind of excavate this edge of the bin that's a little bit closer to me to see what we see. You can see large numbers of worms hanging out here. Normally you would expect to find large numbers of worms down the feeding zone. That's almost a given, assuming there's still some leftovers in the bin like there were here. But other times you also find good numbers of worms hanging out in the portions of the bin that are pretty much as far away from the feeding zone as you can get. So I assume they just sort of come in for a quick bite and then they maybe just go wandering around after they've had their fill. Or maybe they're just not even really cognizant of the fact that the food is only available in one particular spot. Maybe they're just kind of on the move all the time. To tell you the truth, I really couldn't tell you that much about these types of behaviors. Some of it is a little bit of a mystery to me and leaves me wondering. So even though we've attempted to spread the feeding out a little bit better than usual, I'm still going to position the feeding zone indicator down the middle, which is pretty much where the feeding is, even though it's been spread out a little bit more than we normally would. The material in these bins is pretty damp, I must say, and I do wonder if perhaps that excess, I don't even know if I would want to consider it as excess dampness, but high degree of dampness, or possibly a little bit higher than it needs to be. I wonder if that could be contributing to the outbreak I'm seeing here of not only potworms but also the springtails. I've wondered if perhaps in some future check-in, perhaps not too far down the road from now, perhaps we can start driving these systems towards harvest by initially doing what we're doing here, which is to provide stuff that's either going to break down pretty quickly, such as melon, or just small particle-sized foods like the coffee and the worm chow. But then another thing which we've not really embarked on yet, but might happen soon, is the promotion of drying of the material in the systems by swapping out the bubble wrap coverings that we've got going on in these systems right now and possibly replacing them with something a little bit more breathable, like perhaps just a sheet of newspaper or cardboard, or a combination of those two, which would allow for a little bit more airflow and promote the drying of the material in these bins, which the worms might not like as much as they enjoy a really nice damp system like these systems are. But it will give us systems that are a little bit easier to manage when it comes time to harvest, I believe. So we're now bringing back these top covering bits of newspaper, which we're still appearing to hold together well enough for another use. So I'm bringing them back, putting them back to use same way we found them. And I'm assuming that by the next time we come back in here, these top coverings will have deteriorated to the point where they're just going to go down into the feeding zones as supplementary bedding, as we did with the feeding zone indicators, the coffee filters that we've replaced with new ones over here. So that's it for our check-in, everyone, with the European nightcrawlers doing really well in here. Allowed to continue to have nice damp conditions, which will enable them to continue working things down nicely in here. But at some point in the near future, we might start driving things towards harvest by allowing a little bit of drying in here, but not quite yet. I think we're still in good shape as far as leaving these systems as fairly active, you know, tailoring the foods to be small and fast composting stuff, but you know, definitely withholding the application of bedding. Yeah, I was a little bit stingy on bedding. All they got were the old coffee filters, and that will be the trend going forward, because all that bedding will end up just creating, you know, litter within the castings. And when I get down to harvesting the castings, I would like to have stuff that's fairly free of debris. So I got a few things I got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away around here, but that's boring. I'm not going to keep you around for that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.